energy is the master resource and can explain a lot of variables, including currencies and international trade and political upheavals and so on. That we have some peak complacency in Europe. They had a warm winter last year. They have, we think, foolishly confused good luck with sound strategy, and they are rolling the dice going into this winter. The critics will say nuclear takes too long and it's too expensive. That's only because those very same critics have done everything in their power to make it politically and economically impossible to deploy nuclear power on the scale that would be needed to meaningfully decarbonize our economy. Look, Germany and Western Europe escaped catastrophe, for which we're thankful for. Let's ponder the costs of how they were able to escape catastrophe. First, everything is climate change. Nothing is, because we heard for the better part of a decade that drought was stone cold proof of climate change. And then, sure enough, as soon as we get relief from the drought, in fact, we have too much rain now, this is also proof of climate change. We are unabashedly anti-war and pro-peace, and I'm old enough to remember when that was a liberal position that would risk you being branded sort of unpatriotic, and now it's considered, amazingly considered alt-right / Putin puppet. And I do think that we still have enormous inherent advantages that no other country in the world has. And we've tried our best to squander as much of them as possible.
I wanted to kick today off a little bit differently and just have a moment of reflection on the podcast in general. It is such a privilege that I'm so grateful for, to be able to talk to these experts, do these interviews or these episodes or whatever you want to call them, have these conversations with leaders in their industry. To talk to Doomberg, someone who has over 250,000 followers on Twitter. He has over 150,000 subscribers to his Substack, all of which he 100% deserves. I think it is not an exaggeration to say that he is probably the #1 independent analyst in the US. And despite that, he still took an hour and a half to come on our small channel to talk to us about some of the important topics that are going on in the world today. Even though it's pretty obvious we're new to this. I'm still trying to improve every single day, week over week, trying to prep these questions, trying to make sure that I'm articulate and asking good questions, not being disrespectful of these people's time, and trying to create the organization and everything. There's actually a lot more that goes into a podcast than I had originally anticipated, and it's just exciting to me. This is a new experience. This is a great period of growth, and Doomberg especially is someone that I think I got a little bit nervous to talk to, because when I look at Doomberg, I see the ceiling for like where you can go, where you can take this as an independent person within the financial world, covering the news, different research for the masses. I look at him and I say, wow, that's where I aspire to, but that's not where I'm at right now. So I got nervous talking to him, but that's okay. I sometimes feel bad for the guests when I'm like, oh, I should have brought this up earlier. Now we're kind of bouncing around topics too much, but you only get good at this by actually doing it. So, I mean, it's part of what I have to go through to get my reps in, to improve as a podcaster, as a host, as an interviewer. And Doomberg is such an astounding guest. He is such a nice guy, even nicer than I thought he would be. And he is, of course, the star of this episode. He's probably the reason you clicked on this video, and I don't blame you at all. But if you do enjoy this podcast, I would really appreciate you to subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to do my best to get great guests just like him to talk about what's going on in the world today so that you can stay in the know. And with that, I hope you enjoy today's episode.
And, let's just kick it off for the listeners, for the viewers. Why don't you go ahead and just kind of give us a rundown of how you got Doomberg started, some of the ideas that you've come across and come through, and then over the years, how it's transformed into what it is today.
You bet, Monty. And Josh and Monty, great to be here and looking forward to a fantastic discussion. And we had a little banter before we hit record. I know it's going to be a fun one. Yeah, I'm personally a trained scientist and spent a couple of decades working in industry. The Doomberg team comes from sort of a small bespoke group of consultants that we built the firm together, and then COVID came and destroyed our business like many other entrepreneurs / small business owners, and we had to reinvent ourselves. And based on the tip of a pretty well-known hedge fund manager, we decided to create a vertical for our consulting business in the content creation space, targeted towards those who were selling into Wall Street, helping them run their business better. Through that, we learned the content creation market, learned by doing, learned by helping, and one of our top clients ultimately highly encouraged us to start our own thing, because we were pretty good at it. And Doomberg was born in 2021, and a freak of luck is the wrong word, but sort of an accident of history that the global energy crisis hit just as we were in a position to be able to leverage our industrial experience and expertise and write about the problem as it was unfolding. And that is actually the big inefficiency that Doomberg is occupying in the market, which is there's very few people from industry that sort of have that molecular map of how the world works, that are free to comment on the news of the day in the way that we are, because we don't work at a big corporation anymore. We're not encumbered by public affairs teams and worried about being canceled or worried about losing our stock options. And we could speak authentically and provocatively about these topics in a way that is not polarizing, which is one of our brand ambitions. And Doomberg has spiraled to heights that we could never have imagined when we started. And I would close by saying it is truly the work of my life. It was what I was meant to be doing. And if anybody listening or either of you ever find what it is that you're meant to be doing, the strongest piece of advice I could give you is, for heaven's sake, just keep doing it. And so that is the intent of Doomberg. We write 6 to 8 pieces a month on energy, finance, and the economy at large. It's by far the funnest thing I've ever had the privilege of doing, and the thing I'm most proud of having built. And it's just truly a spectacular, life-changing moment for me and the team.
You deserve.
Yeah, it's very incredible.
Yeah. Sorry, Monty. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I was just saying.
No, you go on. You go on.
Oh no, I was just saying you deserve all that success you've had though, because there's a big standout between the work you put out and others in the space. It's something to aspire to as someone who also creates a lot of content. And I
appreciate that.
As Monty said, you've inspired him too. So I just want to.
Well, I would say that for decades, the writing I was doing was hidden behind confidential information at a corporation. And so the pieces that we've been putting out, for example, when we used our 5 questions approach to adjudicate on the likelihood that we had in fact achieved room temperature superconductivity, for example. That is an example of an exercise I would have done in the corporate world when our CEO would read the Financial Times and send me an article and say, hey, Doomberg, which is not how I was known back then, what do you think of this? Is this BS, or should we put a team together? I had probably 100 of those in my career. And so when we see things like that, I would write these pieces up. I developed a framework, and now we've just been able to share it with the public and share the rest of our analysis in a way that I think is pretty unique and fun. And look, it must be said, we have an amazing army of supporters and subscribers, both free and paid, that make it all worthwhile. And we have purposely chosen to be 100% subscriber supported so that we don't have to worry about a point source of vulnerability in today's cancer culture where they attack our our advertisers or our sponsors. And we have a motto around the chicken coop, which is identify your ideal clients, find out where they hang out, entice them, and delight them. And that is the business model that we've been executing. And we take feedback from our paying subscribers with the utmost urgency, and we don't worry about the noise. And that has allowed us to have thousands of bosses instead of one, and that works out very well. And what that means is that, of course, every subscriber is precious, but none is particularly determinative to your future. Like if you write a piece that annoys a half a dozen of your subscribers, hopefully they stick with you, but it's not going to be the end of Doomberg. Whereas if an advertiser or a sponsor pulls their support for you, or frankly, all of them do, that can be a real challenge.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, when I wrote my first short article and published that out there, the amount of attacks that you get from, just whether they're traders, institutional, or whatever they are, having that anonymous screen, I'd imagine, it kind of saves you a little bit of face on, having to combat them, or allows you to combat them even more.
One thing I've learned over the years, Monty, is that if you look hard enough on the internet for somebody saying something bad about you, you will find it. And
probably.
and I'll steal an analogy from Tony Robbins from his fantastic book from the mid-'80s, Unlimited Power, which is as corny as it is effective and well worth the read. You control your mental state, and your mental state controls your performance. As a trader, I'm sure you know this better than anything. And it's much better to have your brain be Teflon than flypaper, because if you're walking around letting people throwing garbage at you affect your mental state, they will achieve the desired outcome and We've been particularly good at handling trolls because inevitably when you take provocative positions on the news of the day, or even people that agree with you but are perhaps jealous of your success because perhaps they're not as skilled at marketing or promoting your own work, and they view the skills that you may be displaying in that arena as somehow diminishing the underlying quality of the product. You just have to walk around the world with a giant piece of Teflon on your head, and don't let the you know what stick when they throw it at you, because they will throw it at you. And so this is especially in the modern internet era where the safety of the keyboard means people would say things to you. Look, I just judging by your appearance, I wouldn't say anything mean to you in person, and I suspect most of the people that are dumping on you after you put something out wouldn't have the courage to do so either. But the keyboard sort of has keyboard courage, as we call it, is a true thing on the internet. You just have to accept it. It's part of the business, and we kind of roll with it.
Oh no, I absolutely feed on it. And win them, and my perspective is win them over with kindness and let them get their aggression out on their side.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I want to draw down a couple questions on, especially, in the beginning of when Doomberg made its appearance on the oil and gas market. So, for the people that don't know, around 2001, that was when WTI went negative, correct? And
2020, yeah.
or that was 2020, excuse me. 2020 was when WTI, that was the spot price. It went negative for a day and rebounded to about $30 a barrel, and made a massive recovery throughout the rest of the year through when Russia invaded Ukraine, and then reverted back to about 80, 70, 60 in that range. And a lot of the discussion at the time was just transforming capture the market share at any cost, to stay in our corner, be responsible, and stick with the demand, or stick with matching supply to demand. And that was kind of the big theme across all commodities, it seemed like, at the time. So my ultimate question is this a sustainable methodology, and do you see it working in the long term, or is there going to be like another resource that's going to come in and fill the void, or a transformation of technology or something of the sort?
So from a fundamental perspective, when we look at sort of a macroeconomic outlook, we always begin with the following question: is the world in a period of energy abundance or energy scarcity? Because we do believe that especially during times of energy scarcity, energy is the master resource and can explain a lot of variables, including currencies and international trade and political upheavals and so on. So in 2020, the front month contract went negative as somebody was caught long oil that they couldn't take for delivery. As you know, WTI is one of the few commodities that's still at expiration. If you don't have a place to store it, you'll have to pay somebody to take it off your hands. That was more of a symbolic episode than it was a meaningful data point. Minus $37 a barrel was where that contract closed. And as you mentioned, by the next day, I think it was in the teens. And then several weeks later, our good friend Tony Greer, who runs TG Macro, as a trader, he was out with a call of a lifetime saying, grab everything you have and mortgage your house and go long oil when it was in the teens. And kudos to him. He's a good friend of ours, I should say, full disclosure. Happy paying subscriber to TG Macro. But what that really demonstrates, and what is a core thesis of our analysis, is the price elasticity of demand for all of the commodities that are necessary for life. And so what we saw at the depths of the COVID crisis was a drop in demand for oil such that the producers of oil couldn't turn off their wells fast enough to avoid filling up the storage capacity in the system, and especially where prices were settled. Because again, these markets, as you know, have their own nuances. And Henry Hub natural gas is different than SoCal, which is different than Dutch TTF, which is different than the Asian benchmark, and they all have their idiosyncrasies and their own supply-demand internal dynamics and their own opportunities for arbitrage. Oil, natural gas, coal, the primary inputs into the economy, when they were in a period of scarcity, things can get very wacky. And when they're in a period of relative abundance, the impact on energy is less determinative at the margin. And so what we saw in the post-COVID stimulus-driven Pfizer vaccine, bull market that came out of the bottom of the of the COVID lockdowns was a world long before Putin invaded Ukraine that was net short energy. And when you're net short energy, regions and countries that are net short, their currencies weaken. And this is why, of course, Putin was able to resist the sanctions and why the euro and the yen and the pound all weakened against the dollar, because basically DXY is a measure of the euro, the yen, and the pound. And so this is a good framework for analysis. I would say during periods of energy shortages, energy probably explains 80% of the variance of Forex movements, for example. And it's just good to have in mind. So when you wake up in the morning as a trader, is the world in relative energy excess or scarcity? Would be the first question that we would have before we would look at the terminal.
All right. And then, kind of focusing on the next step, is there a possibility that there could be something that could correct, I guess, the scarcity? I know that, just across Europe, across the United States, there's all these drives from the government down to transition over to renewable sources, which, it became very apparent those aren't reliable, dependable. Are there other alternatives like going to nuclear that can fill that void?
Yeah, we would be very much in the pro-nuclear camp. We do think that intermittent, as you alluded to, weather-dependent renewables are not suitable for a grid that is expected to be always on. And one of the things that people fail to realize is just how important it is that the grid is always on and that the demand for electricity, for example, is perfectly matched with the supply, which is a real symphony that the operators of modern grids, in the developed world, they get no credit for doing it, but it's really a miracle of modern engineering that they can pull this off. And in fact, the drop off in the value of a grid and its meaning in an economy drops off precipitously with each percentage point of unreliability that you introduce. It doesn't take much in the way of brownouts and blackouts for manufacturing to leave because you just can't operate in those settings. And so push is coming to shove here, predominantly in Germany. We'll see. We characterize the current energy markets as relatively well supplied, oil being perhaps the one exception, and that we have peak complacency in Europe. They had a warm winter last year. They have, we think, foolishly confused good luck with sound strategy, and they are rolling the dice going into this winter. Let's hope they win again. We are not pro chaos and certainly not pro suffering of our many European subscribers, but we're taking a chance. We're rolling the dice. And so the things that, like, for example, at the peak of the energy crisis, if you're looking for things to look at, cues from the screen, the energy corrected price of coal exceeded that of oil, which was the first time in history that we could find that.
Wow.
That's like one of those numbers on a screen that jumps out at you, at least jumps out to us. The way you correct coal and oil is you divide the BTUs inherent in each, and you could see that we were in such an energy crisis that coal, which has some advantages over oil because it's a solid, it's easy to ship, and you could just make a giant pile of it outside of your warehouse and not worry about it, not being there the next day. Coal was more valuable for a period of time. In fact, thermal coal, which we burn to make electricity, was more valuable than coking coal, which we use to make steel, which was a higher quality version of coal. Whenever you see crazy prices that you've never seen in the market before, you know that you're in a new domain and you need to see what's going on. In fact, we told our Pro Tier subscribers that the crisis won't be abated until we see this energy corrected price of coal revert back to historical means under the price of oil, and it has done so now. And so these are the types of things that we do, that we write about, that we provide. We're not traders, but we do provide cues and inputs into other people's processes that they can use to make investment decisions.
Absolutely. And it's just incredible how much more coal has been utilized in the last couple of years since, the natural gas shortage in Europe and, firing back on the coal plants, shutting down the nuclear plants and continuing with coal. It's just incredible how this whole ESG narrative has just turned sideways on itself.
Yeah, we call that the Streisand effect. They have had the opposite intent. The effort to suppress has only created more demand. We're going to set a record for coal production and consumption, both last year and this year, as you say.
So you think it's going to? Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Matthew. I just want to interject because when we talked to Tony Greer, actually, just a few weeks ago, one of the things he said that would actually cause some of the environmental policies that have caused this energy crisis to reverse would likely be an uptick in natural disasters, putting grids offline as they become more and more dependent on clean energy. And I know that you're anti-chaos, but do you, when he said it, it just rang to me as like, that's probably at this point what it feels like it would take. What do you think about that sort of line of thought of that'll probably be what it, be the push that we need?
Yeah, I would partition between what I would like to see happen and what I think we'll see happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what I would like to see happen is we have engaged political discourse where authentically held views are expressed politely and both sides debate, and then we decide on the best course for society and we change. What I suspect will have to happen, as Tony alludes to, is that we will have to suffer a certain amount of pain before we are shocked into making the correct political choices. My concern with that path is it's a bit of a singularity, at least politically. You don't know what you're going to get. And we have warned our friends on the progressive environmental left that if you push too hard, too fast on this, you might not like the political response. You might get sort of what they would call far-right populist movements that have other attributes about them that you might not be comfortable with, but they're winning the minds and hearts of the population because anybody willing to say and do the things that are needed to solve the pain problem can come into office. And whether it's peaceful or not, and we have said many times, on the path from abundance to starvation is riot. I mean, the people will riot. And Tony is correct that that's probably the likely outcome. We don't like to spend too much time dwelling on that because we're still trying to fight the debate fight, the civilized discourse fight. I'll debate anybody on any topic anywhere that has authentically held beliefs that they express politely, within reason, of course. I mean, I'm not going to debate Holocaust deniers or something like that. But in the end, like if you have a view on energy technology that is different from mine, I will engage with you as long as it's polite. And we can start by mapping out where we agree and then drill in on the differences and then see, based on the relative power of each other's arguments, who wins. And I'm always open to change my mind, of course. It's not like we are fixed in our views, and we have learned as we've written Doomberg. One of the most powerful things about Doomberg, we've written 220 pieces. Each of those pieces was researched, consulted with experts, written in a way that we hope was precise and edited properly, such that we have learned along the way, and our opinions have changed. It's just a really great crowdsourcing way. We get most of our ideas now from our subscribers who send us things that we might want to consider writing about. And so as a learning exercise for us, it's been truly incredible. And as we've written more and more pieces and learned more and more, we've become better able to debate people who are willing to do so politely. But I do think that political action can make a difference. We are not as far down the road as Tony, I would say, I'd say cynicism is too strong of a word, but Tony has some pretty strong views on how far down the path we are from a broken country perspective. I think there's still time. At a minimum, it's sort of a Pascal's wager situation. I'm not yet willing to bet against the existence of God.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I always am bullish on humanity and markets in general. I think over time we overcome, but I do want to give Tony his due, because even back before Russia-Ukraine conflicts, when we heard Trump talking to leaders in Europe and they seems completely negligent to your philosophy that energy is life. They saw it as just any normal sort of trade when it came to where they were going to be getting their energy from, or even how they just viewed it in general. It just seems it can be so disheartening to see such a lack of what I feel like is basic knowledge for the importance of energy from people who have so much power for decision making. And I just want to throw the ball to you, and I know this is hard because predictions are not, because these things are very nuanced and complex, but let's say that you were in such a position to kind of steer the ship away from these sort of policies. What would be maybe the first steps that you would take, a priority move that we should make within the next 5 to 10 years?
So before I do that, I want to say something that you mentioned, which is really important. So you mentioned Trump being ridiculed at the UN by the Germans for pointing out their reliance on Russian natural gas. You must recall, of course, that for the period of a decade or a decade and a half, we were in a period of energy abundance.
Yeah.
And why were we in a period of energy abundance? Because of the shale gas revolution. Like 90% of the growth in the production of oil comes out of 6 counties in Texas, to quote our friends at I forget their names now, but and so the U.S. shale revolution tilted the entire world into a period of energy abundance. And when you're in a period of energy abundance, energy is just another commodity and can be ignored. And you could laugh at Trump. It is precisely the time during energy abundance to save for the rainy day of energy. Now, to your question on what we would do if we were king, we actually put out a 4-part plan, which we think is pretty nuanced, and I'm happy to walk you through it. Part one, and I know it by heart because I wrote it, and I have a bit of a photographic memory for the pieces that we've written. One is a renaissance with nuclear power. Nuclear power is by far the highest energy dense, safest, cheapest form of both electricity and energy that humanity has ever stumbled upon. If fission were invented today, it would be hailed as an civilization-saving technology that we should implement post-haste. The critics will say nuclear takes too long and it's too expensive. That's only because those very same critics have done everything in their power to make it politically and economically impossible to deploy nuclear power on the scale that would be needed to meaningfully decarbonize our economy. So that's first and foremost. And this is, by the way, a strategy for U.S. policy. This is not a global policy. The second part of our strategy would be to tap into the enormous, abundant deposits of natural gas that we have in the country, and we would stop using coal. In fact, we pointed out in one of our pieces that the amount of natural gas we export and flare in the fields on an energy basis is roughly equivalent to the amount of coal we burn in the country. And we have an enormous amount of natural gas, and we should be systematically replacing coal with natural gas. It's cleaner. It's got a comparable losing my brain. It's got a comparable performance in power plants where you have the amount of on time that you can have. They're pretty reliable. It burns cleaner, easier to capture CO2. We've profiled a few companies that are developing some interesting technology in that space and so on. The third thing that we would do is we would build a homegrown solar supply chain again. If we're going to use it, we're far less bearish on solar than we are on wind, which is something we could talk about. But we have allowed China to monopolize the vast majority of the polysilicon supply chain, and we could totally make such factories, which are highly energy intense, in the shale patch. Environmentalists will get a homegrown green energy supply chain, and our drill baby drill crowd would have a domestic market for their product. It'd be a great collaboration. And then finally, we would de-emphasize full battery electric vehicles and use our limited battery materials for plug-in hybrids, because you get far more gasoline abated per kilogram of battery materials in that way. And there's just no denying that in the electrification of our transportation sector, battery materials are the constraint. And one thing I've learned in industry is you always manage your constraints. And so I think that's a pretty balanced plan, reconcile with physics and a renaissance with nuclear, replacing our coal with natural gas, building a homegrown polysilicon supply chain, and focusing on plug-in hybrids as a bridging technology to when we develop the batteries like solid state and so on, for when we could do a real a decarbonization of our transportation sector. So that's how we would focus our efforts. And that won't please everybody, but I think there's enough science in there, and there's enough solid foundation from which the rest of the economy can prosper if you know that you have a protracted period of energy abundance ahead of you.
Absolutely. And I want to note too, kind of on top of that, to compound it. I did a couple pieces. I titled them Earth, Wind, and Fire for what was it? Solar, nuclear, or not solar, wind, and nuclear, covering a couple EPC firms in the United States, Quanta Services, as well as Argon. And through my research, what I found is, I think it was 18. It was something like 18 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants are going to be coming offline throughout the next decade, and we're kind of figuring out what we're going to be replacing them with, whether it's natural gas, nuclear, solar, or wind. And what I found in the research is that a lot of these solar fields, a lot of these wind farms, they need that backup capacity to be able to remain sustainable or consistent on their energy flows. So whether we do start depending more and more on solar and wind, and to kind of sidestep on that, or for emphasis, looking at Texas right now, especially during that winter freeze they had, or we had a couple years ago, um, it's pretty clear that these need some backup capacity that are reliable for when they're feeling stressed out. Like right now, heat index in Texas is something like 110, and uh, windmills and solar panels are running at half capacity. So where I'm getting at is, do you see kind of like this double build out if we were to start depending more on renewables, to where we need like natural gas fired power plants to back them up? Or is that going to be something that, like in Texas, back when that infrastructure was being built out, the trade off was you don't need backup capacity? And they found that is a terrible thing. So,
Yeah.
what's your perspective on that?
So the technical phrase is capacity factor, and nuclear is in the 98, 92 to 95% always on stable baseload power. And solar is around 25. But the thing about solar that differentiates it from wind is that it's a little less variable than wind. Wind can be giving you way too much power, then not enough in a matter of days. Whereas generally, for sure, for example, that the sun doesn't shine at night. And I would say solar is terrible for Germany and the UK. Just they have the solar incidence of Maine. We don't have much in the way of solar in Maine in the country, but we do in the Sun Belt. It's called the Sun Belt. And so when it's sunny 350 days a year, and with some predictive capacity how things are going to operate, then you can, as a grid operator, design around that. Wind is a completely different story. And I think we've made the call to our pro tier that the wind sector collapsing is going to be the story of the next 12 to 18 months. The wind industry has made a lot of major mistakes in their zeal for blade length in the name of efficiency. They have underestimated the stress on the balance of systems. I think every installed wind turbine, both onshore and offshore, is a stationary liability for somebody somewhere. These things are falling apart, not living long enough, underproducing when needed, overproducing when needed. Somebody put something out on Notes the other day. It's a very deceptive chart, and it annoys me when people do this. They took the spot price of electricity and showed that the more renewables you have pouring into the grid, the price goes negative. And I was like, that's not a good thing. So first of all, what that means is these intermittent sources are producing way more power than is needed. And it works in reverse. There are periods of time where they produce no power, and this entire architecture of backup must fire up, which is dirty and expensive and inefficient. And those costs are never added to the cost of solar and wind. They're tied to the cost of the backup plant, which is the most perverse. Levelized cost of electricity is basically a fraud. And by the way, for the wind producers, it's no good for them either. If the spot price, the more they produce, the lower the price goes. It's classic commodity dynamics. So the spot price in a windy period of time in the UK in July goes negative. What happens during the doldrums in the winter when energy is needed most, and the wind stops blowing? And so then prices skyrocket, and integrated over the totality of those two periods, the prices don't go negative enough to make up for the amount that they skyrocket during shortages, because having too much of something is a little bit easier to handle than having not enough of it, which creates a crisis. And people knowingly, I think, well, I don't know, a lot of people don't understand the nuances, and they're just ignorant. But there is a small subset of influencers in the renewable space who knowingly deceive people with this nonsense, as though, look at how cheap electricity is because it was temporarily negative on a hot, windy day in the UK. It's such nonsense as to be, it's ethically very dubious, let's put it that way.
Yeah, to presume that a company will take or pay for distributing electricity is a little bit absurd. And kind of on that note, just going into Europe during their little energy crisis last year, I think a lot of people, I mean, the financial world is very short-sighted, and a lot of people seem to have forgotten how strained Europe, the whole bloc, was throughout the last year while they were filling up their storage capacity, in which manufacturing plants were either shut off or running on an intermittent schedule. Street lights were turned off at a certain hour. Restaurants were only able to stay open until a certain period of time. And, I think a lot of that strain, a lot of the curtailment of the S and ESG, I think a lot of people just forgot that occurred. And, you know, having shut off the nuclear plants this last year and continuing forward on, moving towards this ESG ordeal, I think it's just that short-sightedness that catches people off guard.
Monty, it's even worse than that. So, look, Germany and Western Europe escaped catastrophe, for which we're thankful for. Let's ponder the costs of how they were able to escape catastrophe. First, they scoured the world in search of every BTU of energy they could buy, regardless of price, carbon footprint, or impact on the developing world. Germany destroyed the electricity grid of Pakistan. Like, that's
oh my God. Yeah, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, so they bought up every every cargo of LNG they could. Pakistan had become very dependent on LNG based on the prospect of abundant and cheap natural gas, based on predominantly the build out in Qatar and the US shale patch. And they outbid the Pakistanis and several other countries, and threw the entire country of Pakistan, which has 250 million people, into an energy crisis. That's one of the costs in the ledger of this crisis. But the second thing they did was they retreated to the coal mines, as we wrote in a piece, with the speed and efficiency of the evacuation of Dunkirk. I mean, these people they opened up, I think, something like 16 gigawatts of coal capacity during the winter, the mild winter that we had, which was, again, a blessing. The whims of Gaia was the name of the piece that we wrote. I mean, in late December, basically saying that the crisis had passed and Germany had been able to, evade the worst case scenario of literally shivering people in the streets in Berlin. The German electricity grid was amongst the dirtiest in the entire European Union, despite having spent $1 trillion on renewable energy, only surpassed by Poland, who was not foolish enough to relieve itself of its coal to begin with. And many people in Poland actually heat their homes by burning coal in their furnaces. And so the German electricity grid, despite having spent hundreds of billions of dollars on their energy transformation, was the dirtiest in the European Union, effectively. Certainly corrected for wasted investment. And then beyond that, despite the fact that people were spiking the football on having averted the worst case scenarios, they are rapidly deindustrializing. None of the front end industries feel as though they have the confidence in the German leadership that they can operate over a multi-decade period, which is the time frame that you have to decide upon when you're making investment decisions. We wrote a piece called Moribund Verbund last year about BASF and their super site in Ludwigshafen. And all their big investments are going to China, and they're firing people in Germany. And this is one of the most iconic, important, successful companies that the planet has ever known. We joke in many of our pieces that people have this view of the commodity players as old, stodgy companies. These are amongst the most important technical powerhouses on the planet. And every day, tens of thousands of brilliant engineers and scientists do the dizzying array of incredibly hard work that makes life for the rest of us easy, which makes our disdain for them all the more peculiar. And BASF invented the Haber process, which is the single most important industrial development of the century, and is responsible for our ability to feed an extra 1 billion or 2 people on the planet. For those that don't know, the Haber process is how you take coal or natural gas and you turn it into fertilizer. And without the advances of synthetic fertilizer, which BASF championed in the early part of the 20th century, we wouldn't be talking. There'd be less of us, a lot less of us. And so the penalty side of the ledger is enormous. Estimates are that Germany spent $500 billion to abate the worst case scenario risk. That might not seem like a lot to us Americans, who, members of Congress might not bend over to pick up $10 billion if they saw it on the sidewalk today. But to the Germans and to an economy that size, that's an enormous amount of money. And then to top it all off, they have convinced themselves of the brilliance of their strategy because they avoided worst case scenario risk, and they're hurtling towards the winter of 23-24, having shut down 3 more nuclear power plants and arrogantly assuming that they were right all along. I would say, and we're not meteorologists, March of 2023 marked the end of a 3-year La Nina cycle. And in such cycles, Western Europe has unusually warm weather in the winter. And we are entering what looks like a very strong El Nino. And if you just look at its history, the US Northeast and Western Europe tends to have extremely dry and very cold winters during El Ninos. Now, we've heard some pushback about the volcano eruption spewing a bunch of water into the atmosphere, which might make things warmer for longer, which we hope is true. But I wouldn't be gambling the future of my people on the whims of Gaia. And once again, this winter, Germany is hell-bent on doing just that.
Yeah, weather is not a force to reckon with, nor bacon expectations for. It can turn in an instant, as we're aware. And just looking at the western coast of this country, seeing the Hurricane Hillary flood San Diego, Nevada, it's pretty incredible that, just how weather patterns can change over time.
Well, I wanted to maybe touch on the water shortages as well on that topic. Do you think that the amount of because we were worried about the Colorado, Monty might need a layup on this one or an assist on this, but there was a water shortages. There's trouble with the Colorado water. California has also had a lot of issues. Do you think that maybe one of the positives of this hurricane and the excessive amount of water they've received in one day is the equivalent to like a year of what they usually get?
Yeah.
Will actually give some positives to this, whereas I think the hurricane will also just highlight it's these things like hurricanes. And just tell me if I'm just off base about this, but it makes me worried about things like solar power and stuff like this. Like these, I don't know if these panels, especially that are built in these areas, are designed to handle that. And that seems like back to the Tony Greer idea of like these natural disasters, this clean energy sources are they're more, they can be victims of this more easily than something like an energy power plant, a nuclear power plant would be. And so just two questions there. Yeah,
we wrote a couple of pieces in July, even before this hurricane, calling the end of the water crisis in the West and Colorado and so on. And the first piece was called Frame of Reference, I believe, and then the second piece was called Wet Blanket. And ultimately, in Wet Blanket in particular, we talked through how the deluge of rain that we saw in California and in the U.S. West had ended a multi-decade-long drought. And it was a severe drought. Let's not kid ourselves. It was a big deal. Colorado River in particular, we wrote a piece last year called Buy Me a River, where we talked about the political complexities involved in allocating the water rights up and down the Colorado and in their watersheds. It's really a fascinating topic. We could write 10 pieces on it. The theme of our piece was, if everything is climate change, nothing is, because we heard for the better part of a decade that drought was stone cold proof of climate change. And then sure enough, as soon as we get relief from the drought, in fact, we have too much rain now, this is also proof of climate change. And so it's hard to take people seriously when everything is evidence for their hypothesis, and their hypothesis cannot be nullified, which is sort of the ultimate form of nonsense, and not certainly the farthest thing from science that one can imagine. But yes, long before Hillary, there has been a shift in the weather, and there's so much water in California today that we risk going from drought to flood. And thankfully, for the residents who depend on the Colorado River, that has extended throughout much of the U.S. Southwest. The snowpack was still melting by the time we'd written that piece in July, as such that people who had been pointing at the cascading series of ever lower measurements on the Colorado River as proof positive of alarmism and catastrophe are going to have to find a new narrative. And they're, of course, setting about the task of finding them as we speak. But we did point out the numbers and pointed out that we believe that particular episode is now over. And we're probably going to head to a period of time now where those very large hydroelectric dams on the Colorado River will have ample supply behind them, and we'll be able to, suitably support their grids. Ironically, of course, hydroelectric dams along the Colorado and in Norway and various other places in Quebec where they've done it, these are actually ideal for the potential absorption of intermittent sources of power like wind and solar, because they can very easily toggle up and down within seconds. And in fact, the water behind a dam can be viewed as a giant battery, because that is just future production of electricity that an operator of a hydroelectric dam can produce within reason. Of course, you can't let it overflow and all the other things. But for example, the country of Norway has behind its collective hydroelectric dam network something like the equivalent of 70% of its annual electricity production in storage. That's how you can then top off with wind and solar, not worry about the intermittency that you're experiencing in Texas and in Germany and other places. And ironically, perhaps unsurprisingly, environmentalists are opposed to the construction of new dams because it does, in fact, have significant detrimental effect to the local environment. There's no question about it. We're putting out a piece tomorrow on the development of copper mines and how, you know, our refusal to do them here only forces us to do them there. There's going to be, you know, a certain price to be paid. We closed that piece by saying there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Hydro has a lot of challenges, but one of the things hydropower does is it allows for the introduction of more renewables. And the rains that are flooding California today, you know, Hurricane Hillary notwithstanding, long prior to that, it was all during the winter. It started in November of last year, and it's been a really amazing, you know, life-altering deluge. That brings with it some positives and some negatives. And the positives are the drought is over, and the hydroelectric dams, the major, giant, regionally critically important hydroelectric dams like at Lake Powell and so on, are no longer in jeopardy of running dry and having to cut power. And so this is a good thing, unabashedly a good thing in aggregate.
Absolutely. And or do you have any more questions on that note, Josh?
Well, I do a lot of content. I've had some good growth on YouTube, but I've had outstanding growth on TikTok. Especially as I've kind of delved into these conversations, and I get a lot of backlash, a lot of people mashing up my videos that are, I've come to view them now as being cult-like, because it doesn't matter what you say. You know, you have such, like, you've provided me with so much ammo and information. This has been fantastic. But I've also come to the realization a lot of these people are so deep in the trenches on their beliefs, like they're not going to change. And so a tactic that I've now pivoted to that seems to be working right now is just talking about the positive changes that can come to the benefit of society as a whole if we get energy prices as low as possible through the incorporation of better systems rather than having this scarcity. And so I was wondering if, you know, let's say your 4-step plan gets enacted, you're in charge, you're king, you're allowed to incorporate that, and prices come down. Nuclear energy is like, I guess I would consolidate that to this question is, what do you think a nuclear powered world looks like from the aspect of cost of food or cost of manufacturing and cost of goods and the amount of a good that can be done from that? Like, what would how impactful do you think that would be to how society functions as a whole?
I'm a big believer in cycles, and I think we would just ultimately squander it out of complacency, and then we would be forced back into another crisis.
Yeah.
These things they come in cycles, right? And so, like today, look, I've got kids, you know, high school / college age kids, and to my children, who they sort of don't admit to their friends that you know, their father writes Doomberg. Electricity comes from a switch, and food arrives with the tapping of a few buttons on a phone, and it's not their fault. It's all they've ever known. We've been fortunate enough to provide them a good life, and so they become complacent, fat and happy, as the old expression would say. And so if Doomberg were to be made king for a decade, that's about as long as it would probably take. Within a decade after that, the leaders who replaced me would squander it. And we would just be back into another crisis mode, because complacency is very hard. You know, it's in our human nature to create crises and then solve them. And you know, especially, we like to say, and it's kind of like a flippant thing to say, but climate change is truly a luxury of the rich. Like, if you're amongst the 5 billion people in the global south for whom the bottom slice of Maslow's pyramid of needs is not met on a daily basis, you could give a rat's you-know-what about the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. You're trying to get some pure water, maybe get a bar of soap, get enough calories to feed your kid, get some wood to burn, and hope that you don't choke on it. These are real 5 billion people. Like, these are all humans like me and you, Josh, and you, Monty. Like, they're no different. They have parents, they have siblings, they have friends, they have culture. And who are we to deny them of the life-nourishing energy that they desperately need to climb Maslow's hierarchy of needs? When you have the luxury to pontificate about and to philosophize about the optimum way that we should be extracting our energy, then you truly are among the richest people on the planet, and we should never lose track of that. But within a decade, people would revert back to taking advantage of or taking for granted the abundance that we have, and we would probably revert back into some form of shortage.
Absolutely, and that really puts into perspective how blessed we are, not having to, fight for our energy and resources.
But exactly, definitely. But as you level up, because over time, the average wage of people has increased, the standard of living globally has slowly marched forward. We're in a slight decline right now if you look at the data, but as you do bring people to more, as you provide them with more of their basic needs, they naturally clean up the environment around them. So if you're
100%.
As you're a true environmentalist, your number one goal should be to make everyone as rich as possible. And I think the best way to do that is to lower these energy prices. And I don't want to get too hypothetical, but I'm also curious what you think squandering nuclear energy would look like. Like how would you, if you set up all these systems and stuff, and most of the energy, we use a supplemental from the clean energy, but if you set up all these. Yeah.
So as a general rule, your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to waste. And I use waste in a thermodynamic sense, not in the flippant, abusive sense. Mm-hmm. And all humans everywhere want a higher standard of living. And so when we do create energy abundance, humans find creative ways to waste it. And that's what, you're asking me what would happen. I think that's what would happen. And I would be the first to make that call in our pieces when we've reached sort of peak complacency, peak energy. There is a lot of good that comes from it, of course. Yes, of course. Fossil fuels can create the machines that clean up the air, that clean up the oceans, and we just have to direct them to do so. We wrote about direct air capture in the last piece, which to us is a giant waste of energy when people are shorted around the world. But the technology and the science is being invented. Look, there is such a nirvana. It exists. It's called Norway. So Norway today, as we wrote in a piece called Stuck in the Middle with You, they get 90% of their electricity from carbon-free hydropower. The balance comes from renewables like wind, and they leverage their hydroelectric dam network in order to handle the intermittency, because again, this system is a giant battery. They are blessed with an enormous amount of natural gas and oil, which they drill for, sell to the rest of the world, and then put into this amazing national pension fund that is the property of all the people of Norway. And as of March of 2023, the value of that fund, which is one of the largest equity investors in the world, and what it's doing is something that should be on the radar of every trader on the planet. The value of that fund was roughly $250,000 per citizen. They have an abundance of energy. They have a really clean environment. 90% of their new cars, by the way, today that are sold are either full battery electric or plug-in hybrids. And they seem to be relatively happy people, and they have the wisdom to think forward and to save for the future generations. And so it can happen. They have not yet fallen for the trick of squandering it, and kudos to them, and let's hope that they don't. And so maybe they're the analogy that we should all hope and strive for here in the U.S. The U.S., Canada, Mexico are similarly blessed, by the way. I mean, the NAFTA region, if we drew a line around those three countries, my God, what a powerhouse of energy and labor and natural resources and farmland and waterways and uranium and can-do nuclear technology and fracking technology and capitalism and great universities and deep water ports. Like, it's all there. We just got to get out of our way and stop being stupid. And we will eventually stop being stupid when we felt enough pain, as we mentioned earlier. But we have, we are long-term bullish humanity, long-term bullish US, long-term bullish Europe. Look, Germany and Japan were utterly destroyed in World War II, and within decades, they were amongst the manufacturing powerhouses on the planet. This too shall pass. We're deeply long the human spirit.
So that's a good segue into my next question. And that relates to the steel industry. It's recent news that Cleveland Cliffs put their bid out for U.S. Steel, followed by what was that private company's name? It just slipped my mind. And then ArcelorMittal is considering putting out a bid. I don't think they're going to, given their divestiture of United States steel production a few years back, but it just may come to fruition given how much the politics have changed with the IRA, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Bill, or that's the what's the other one? The Infrastructure Bill. Excuse me. So my question is, do you see any bright spots if that merger were to come to? Do you see any antitrust issues with the concentration of, flat rolled sheet steel, blast furnaces and things of that sort? Or do you have any opinions on that? And do you expect it to potentially be inflationary given, how dependent a lot of these renewable resources are on steel? I think it was something like 150 tons of steel required to build a windmill or 1 megawatt of wind power.
Wind turbine, yeah, the stem of the wind turbine, yeah. Yeah, I would
There
say
we
to the narrow question of antitrust, I do think that the FTC is looking for a few wins and a scalp or two, and so there might be some risk. I'm not sure what the ARB looks like post announcement and whether there's a sufficient spread to capture that risk. I think the market will tell you long in advance, as you know better probably than most. But to the broader question of critical commodities, and steel would certainly be among them. These are the industries that have been overlooked, that have very low multiples, that are forming sort of at the forming phase of being sort of the modern tobacco companies in the next 10 to 20 years. They produce an enormous amount of cash. A lot of allocators and the people they allocate to can't own them, which means that you should own them for dividends and reinvestment and liquidity events like takeovers, as opposed to hoping to get a greater fool's trade and get a multiple uplift. I do think that, if you had the courage to buy struggling coal companies in the months after the COVID lockdowns, you would have made a career-making trade, plug your nose and count the money. And I think that's what we're seeing across a variety of commodities. If you just look at the BCOM index compared to the QQQs, that ratio is still barely off the mat, as Tony, more than anybody, Tony Greer would probably talk to you guys about when he appeared with you. And I do think that our view, by the way, we have a trading philosophy, which is we earn money in fiat, which is a recognition that we live in a US dollar world. We save money by buying real assets like gold, silver, land, and collectibles. And then we invest privately where we can affect the outcome and create our own sort of sweat alpha, as we call it, where we can interface with management and help them create. I do think there's going to be enormous opportunities in the commodity sector to take things private, because the market is not rewarding the cash flows in the same way that they would reward a cash flow at Meta or at Google, or pick your favorite market darling, or at NVIDIA, presuming they have any cash flows of consequence. The private markets are going to be where I think you could see, as an investor, disproportionate returns, which of course is different than trading. Yeah, I think this particular merger, the FTC has suffered a couple of setbacks. Particularly, I think they've been a bit depantsed in the Microsoft case recently, and they might be looking for a scalp, or they might be timid. It's hard to say. I would take a look at the ARB, and I would respect what the market is saying, but to be honest with you, I've not looked at it ahead of this reporting.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I feel like if Lorenzo wasn't so forefront, and I'll just call it analyst bashing in the early, I guess in 2020, he wouldn't have much of a public image outside of the institutional investors.
He doesn't make for the most sympathetic of CEOs, that's for sure.
No, I just love listening to him on the calls. I think he's tamed down in the last year or so, but it was definitely worth listening to. And then just kind of discerning further on that point, if let's say the merger were to come through, they were in total control of the United States blast furnaces. And just, assuming what he describes as having higher quality steel based on utilizing hot bricked iron or virgin to create virgin steel, he pretty much would be the only producer of this higher quality steel in the United States now if it were to go through, and essentially have pricing control. He would be able to, turn off and on furnaces to his own whim, with the understanding that these aren't necessarily meant to be turned off and on, but he has the potential to be able to do so, and basically have more control on the price of steel that he personally has been trying to drive to a higher price to benefit Cleveland Cliffs and shareholders. So, I guess with that backdrop, do you think this could be highly inflationary, or do you think there's going to be some sort of like price controls put in place to where he can't just have total power over volumes and pricing?
I would caution by starting my answer by saying that I'm far more familiar with the coking coal market than I am the steel market, even though coking coal feeds into steel for a variety of reasons, and an accident of history or two. It's just an area that I've studied more thoroughly. I would say that the key phrase that you mentioned was U.S. market share, and steel is, of course, a globally traded fungible commodity with a massive amount of production in India and China. And in fact, I'm not sure what the current state of tariffs are with respect to Chinese dumping of steel, but there's lots of toggles to be played to minimize the monopolistic aspect of the potential merger, which is undoubtedly what they will argue as they try to get the merger deal done. And so it might actually benefit the U.S. to have a unified point source player that can compete on the international stage in a way, as opposed to having everybody undercutting each other as China, burps onto the market excess steel in a way to try to gain global market share, which is, from my personal experience, what they must be doing in the steel market, which is what they did in the solar market when I was in it, and they took over polysilicon production. So I think that there's probably a case to be made that the monopolistic assessment shouldn't be national, but it should be international. And if I were advising Cleveland Cliffs, this is the points that I would be making, again, not having studied the situation as carefully as you have.
Yeah, and that's primarily why they were pushing for being a global competitor, and
Yeah.
yeah, okay. And going over the fence to China, and then you mentioned a little bit about copper in your newest paper. Is there any hopes for a turnaround in China? And how would that look like if it were to occur?
I always caution questions put to me about China by starting in full humility that it is our view that any Western analyst that claims to have definitive knowledge of what's going inside of China should be met with significant skepticism. Propaganda on both sides of the ocean is very thick. And is it a coincidence, for example, that we're hit with a deluge of China economic weakness and collapse the week ahead of the BRICS summit, where there's all this potential talk of a challenge to the U.S. dollar? And as our friend Luke Groman, I always like to point out where I get such ideas. Luke Groman at Force for the Trees wrote in his recent weekly missive that is it a coincidence that all of the BRICS currencies were under assault in the markets a week ahead of the upcoming summit? I don't know. Anytime I read anything about China, the first question I ask myself is, why am I, Ben Hunt's famous question, why am I reading this now? And we recently put a piece out about Kyle Bass's pretty remarkable presentation at the Hudson Institute, which, as we said in the piece, the piece was called Critical Leverage. The Hudson Institute never saw a war it didn't like. And why is, this CNBC regular and a financial hedge fund manager serving up red meat to a room of self-described neocons who are setting about the task of searching the world for kinetic conflicts to engage in so that they can presumably appreciate some solid returns on their defense stocks. It was really a remarkable thing, and he made the case that China is marching headlong towards war. It was a pretty interesting presentation. We enjoyed it. It was just one of those moments where, like, well, he may very well be right, but why are we hearing this now? And so, to your question about what if China, quote, comes back, our friends in China are talking about, there's a few issues and things at the margin, but nobody's really talking about economic collapse in the way that the mainstream media in the Western world is portraying it. I don't know, hard to say. If you look at oil prices and oil demand, it's hard to find massive collapse of one of the most important economies in the world in those demand numbers. But the narrative of the day, no matter where you look, is that China's struggling, property market, defaults, pick your favorite. I mean, we've known that the Chinese property bubble was going to pop for years. Why is it all of a sudden the most important thing that we all need to be reading about today? It just happens to be that it is. And so I have a combination of skepticism and ignorance on the topic that forbids me from taking too definitive a position on it. I tend to look at the market cues. I see LNG prices tightening back up ahead of the winter. I see oil prices holding in the 80s for WTI and a little bit higher for Brent. I don't see a world where we're talking about the collapse of the Chinese manufacturing engine to the extent that the narrative today is making us believe. It could very well be. Not making a call either way. There's a little bit of skepticism on the bearishness that we're seeing in the market.
Yeah, that's reasonable. And just the other day, I was pondering on kind of that idea that you brought up, the timing of everything, how, what was it? Was it 2020 or 21 when China basically just cut off shipments of copper from Australia? And
coal.
then
Yeah, it was coal.
It was coal. I thought it was copper as well.
Well, for sure it was coal, back to my knowledge of the coal markets versus others. But for sure it was coal. And they rely on Australia for coal far more than they do on copper. In fact, China is one of the largest copper producers in the world, and Australia is not in the top 5. So I would say it was probably iron is what you're thinking of.
Okay, iron.
Yeah.
That would make more sense. Yeah, and just coinciding with, the news flow of the property developers collapsing, it makes you wonder, was that kind of a facade to save cheese and face on, some of the more challenging underlying issues of the property developers, or was it, factual issue that they had with Australia?
So the issue
just,
with the cover story is that Australia was questioning the origin of the COVID-19, and whether it came out of the lab in Wuhan, and that was apparently the source of the diplomatic row that caused them to limit imports of iron ore and coking coal, which are the 2 key ingredients, of course, to making steel. But in the piece we're putting out on copper, the Democratic Republic of Congo is responsible for 75% of the world's growth in copper supply since 2016, and that's all basically Chinese state-owned enterprises in there doing that. And China has set about the task through Belt and Road and various other initiatives of both flipping people on their position of Taiwan and also leveraging resources in exchange for expertise, funding, debt, building dams, and all the things the U.S. did in the 50s and 60s around the world in the Cold War against the Soviet Union at the time. And China is replicating the confessions of an economic hitman playbook, and doing so with perhaps a bit more efficiency, as they have internalized the lessons that we should have learned in such escapades. And so, again, I try to understand President Xi and his inner circle and the workings they're in. I would say this is far enough outside of our depth of expertise that I would hesitate to give a definitive answer. I'm a speculator and a reader and an interested one, much like you guys are.
All right. Yeah, and one interesting thing, just to, I guess, note on their, I don't want to call it imperialistic footprint, but just fueling this Belt and Road growth through debt, as well as on a lot of these projects. From I don't know if this is true. You might be able to discern better on it, but from what I understand is that they kind of bring in their own people. There's less benefit to the local economies and development of resources. And when all is said and done, there comes this debt issue that if it can't be repaid, they just push out the maturity. They don't renegotiate and just kind of continue until, I don't know what would happen at the end of it, whether they can take their claims or what, but It seems
So
like that's the strategy with them.
that's certainly the spin that our propaganda puts on it. How much of that is real? The amount of support that China has been able to accumulate probably is surprising to many in the West for a variety of reasons. And our policies are perhaps a bit less popular in these countries than we perhaps assume. And so it's probably somewhere in the middle, Monty, if I'm being honest with you. Again, um, I see the seizing of the Russian reserves as a seminal moment in history. And I think that opened up the eyes of a lot of leaders in various countries to the risks they were taking by submitting to the US dollar hegemony and all of the sort of pluses and minuses that come from that. And to the extent that China is executing its own national ambitions, they have been dealt a relatively strong hand to play to those fears. Everybody is observing. But it's very interesting that the non-aligned countries, the global South, haven't really taken a strong stance on the war in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia and the U.S. sanctions, and we've kind of just allowed that to happen without picking too much of a fight about it. India, in particular, is still doing substantial business with Russia, and in fact, Indian refining of Russian oil is what bailed out the U.S. Northeast from the diesel crisis last summer. And it's something we wrote about in a piece a few months ago. And so it's a bit of a nuanced question. I think China is a critically important country. It's a nuclear superpower. It's still a massive manufacturing hub. And yes, they have some demographic issues, but by and large, they're still a source of substantial global growth and a force to be reckoned with. And so I don't see that changing anytime soon. We do worry about conflict in Asia. I do feel that President Xi, by all outside appearances, is kind of operating a Stalinist type leadership strategy based on fear. And our view from the corporate world, where analogies I think are very applicable to political leadership, that is not an environment that is conducive to distilling the truth up from an organization. And in fact, you are training people to tell you exactly what they think you want to hear, which can lead to bad decisions and poor outcomes. And heaven forbid, that's what's going on with Xi and his relative strength versus the US and the Taiwan situation. So that would be a major black swan risk that would be on our board to worry about. In fact, we put a presentation together for our July Doom Zoom for our pro tier called Doom Scrolling, searching the globe for things to worry about. And war over the Taiwan situation was high on that list.
And I was just about to segue into that topic too. Thank you for bringing it up for me. But do you have, and it might be a loaded question, but do you have any expectations, presumptions? Are there actual risks involved in China absorbing Taiwan and potentially causing a conflict? Or
Absolutely,
is that
yeah,
kind of
probably the top risk on the board. Misunderstanding or provocations. Look, we're unabashedly anti-war and pro-peace, and I'm old enough to remember when that was a liberal position that would risk you being branded sort of unpatriotic, and now it's considered amazingly considered alt-right / Putin puppet. As the parent of draft eligible children, I would at least appreciate if my congressperson was allowed to vote on the matter before we engage with nuclear superpowers in what could be a risking humanity type situation. Absolutely, there's significant risk. Just economically, the concentration of semiconductor production in Taiwan makes it an absolute total unmodeled, 10 sigma type event where all bets are off, like negative oil was, in post-COVID, and even worse, of course. And so, I do think, if you pushed us, we would argue that Kyle Bass's presentation that Xi is marching towards war could just as easily be interpreted as preemptive defensive mindset against after having observed what we did to Putin vis-a-vis the sanctions. But we didn't think Putin would go to war either, so we're not making a call either way. I think Putin overplayed his hand, and it was pretty foolish to cross into Ukraine. But and that's why we thought he wouldn't. But he proved us wrong on that regard, and we own that incorrect prognosis. But here, I would say crossing the Taiwan Strait and doing a sort of traditional military style marine assault on Taiwan. Look, there's a reason why we didn't invade Formosa in World War II, which is what the country was known as back then. Then we went into Okinawa instead. It's because it was impenetrable and we couldn't do it. I mean, we could bomb it into oblivion, but we were never going to be able to assault it in the way that we did. We just skipped it. We did the old island hopping, and that's all of those constraints are as true today as they were back then, in our view. And so, if there is sort of a move, quote unquote, in Taiwan, we would, if you pushed us, would say it probably won't look like we're all expecting it to look like. It'd be some other form of warfare. A blockade or a cyber assault or a shutting down of their internet and a political upheaval where they've landed all of these people onto the island, disguised as civilian passengers and tourists, and suddenly they're on the ground and operating and taking over the country. I don't think a traditional D-Day raid across the Taiwan Strait is in the offing. I'd be very surprised if that's what we see in the months ahead.
No, absolutely. And just thinking about how much of the semiconductor industry Taiwan controls, and I think it was a Wall Street Journal article that discussed the employment prospects in the United States once these fabs are built. I think there were something like 29 fabs across the United States that are currently undergoing construction. And that's all great, but at the end of the day, who's going to be running these machines and building the chips?
Yeah,
this is Taiwan semi.
This is the big unknown. Like the semiconductor industry is not about machines and equipment. It's about people and know-how. And this is the biggest risk to our build out of a domestic. Look, we're really great at design. So what we're talking about here is closing that loop. But the magic is not in the machines and it's not in the books. It's in the several hundred, very small number of people that actually know how to run these machines properly and minimize waste and produce a good product. And this is going to be incredibly challenging for the U.S. And it's one of the reasons why we think that the nuclear renaissance is again, we've lost a lot of know-how, and the modern U.S. civilian nuclear industry is staffed with aging ex-Navy sailors who worked on nuclear subs and have that technology and that know-how, and these people are dying off, and we need to train the next generation. We're not producing the petroleum engineers and the nuclear scientists and the nuclear technicians that we need. And the human capital could very quickly become a constraint. And we hope that the chip making renaissance that the US is trying to stoke will succeed. But having spent time in that industry and sold into it, this is truly a know-how game, much more so than it is a finance game. Here, the everlasting conflict between labor and capital. Labor is the dominant force in chips.
Absolutely. And that's what makes me nervous, to where I think the nearest term plant or fab is going to be finished with construction in 27, 28 or so. And that kind of gives us this huge gap in production, or domesticating production, and becoming less dependent on foreign production. And my thoughts are, if she were to do anything, going to that blockade point you made, that can be what takes down the United States, in that sense, to where if we can't source semiconductors from Taiwan and we can't produce them domestically, that's basically all he has to do. He doesn't have to necessarily invade, bomb, or march his army onto their land. They pretty much just need to cut off our source of semiconductors. And it's not necessarily just Taiwan that's falling to their knees, it's the US, right?
It would be mutually assured destruction. And then the question becomes, which of the two countries is more capable of suffering the amount of pain that would ensue in such a standoff? And so, of course, we could stop the oil shipments out of the Middle East very easily. The Chinese Navy pales in comparison to the strength of the US's Blue Water Navy. And we could also, obviously, China is a net importer of energy across multiple dimensions, but also a net importer of food. And we could very quickly cut them off as well. But yes, China, as we wrote in the piece where we covered Kyle Bass's presentation, China has covertly and overtly positioned themselves to have monopoly position across an entire plethora of critical supply chains, including several military supply chains. The piece we wrote on August 15th is called Critical Leverage. And we responded to Kyle Bass by saying, like, are you aware of just in how many supply chains the Chinese have taken 90 plus monopolistic like positions in rare earths and in solar, anything to do with energy, with transformers, you name it. Like, it's not like they wouldn't be able to fight back. And we would argue, perhaps pessimistically, that the U.S. is far less capable of suffering than the Chinese are. They run an autocratic regime, a dictatorship, and they could just order the people to suffer, and they would probably have very little choice. Whereas here, when the price of oil reached $125 a barrel and gasoline was kissing $6 nationwide, Joe Biden panicked, emptied the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and did everything he could to browbeat the oil industry into producing more oil ahead of the elections, because he knows that was the kiss of death for his political career. We can't handle $6 a gallon gas. How are we going to handle, a complete shutdown of the chips? And so we'll see. Well, let's hope we don't see, to be totally honest, back to our pro-peace position.
But Josh, do you have any?
I hope I don't butcher this, but I was listening to a Twitter Spaces recently with a few big names in the financial space. Mike Green especially was answering questions from a few guests when it comes to potential oil shortage coming up, and they were having a very hyperbolic conversation about oil going back to 100, $80 a barrel, and how the reserves are already drained, and we've seen some headlines about them being refilled, but that hasn't occurred. And so people were asking him about that, and he said that it likely wouldn't be an issue, because if we stopped just exporting, we would have enough to get by, and we could keep those prices down if we just quit exporting and use them domestically. Now, and maybe even Monty could answer this, but I'll of course, you're here. I'll ask you. Is that actually
pro at this?
Yeah, is this actually accurate? Because I don't know enough about the different types of oil, although I do know. Yeah. So
I'd be the last to disagree with Mike Green, who I respect and is a good friend of ours, and not having heard the spaces firsthand.
Absolutely.
I'll just sort of answer in the broadest sense. The U.S. is, in aggregate, energy sufficient, but the fleet of U.S. refineries are not optimized for the weight of oil that we are producing. We generally, through the shale, produce light oil, and our refiners along the Gulf Coast were tailor-made to refine oil predominantly from Venezuela when they were built, which is a heavy oil, analogous to the Canadian Alberta, Western Canadian select type oil. And so these are barriers and suboptimalities that don't need to be addressed when you have the free flow of trade, such that we can send our light oil to refiners that have been optimized to process that, and receive in return heavy oils. But between our natural gas, coal, and oil production, and the relative, it's not anywhere near the challenge that chips are, for example. We know how to build refineries that can process the oil that we're producing. We're choosing not to for two reasons. One, we have free-flowing imports and exports, and two, the regulatory barriers to doing so are impossible to make such investments negative NPV for the companies that have the skills and capabilities to do so. In a national emergency, of course, you could cut through such red tape. I mean, if you had to. These are, again, like nuclear power is expensive and takes too long because environmentalists have set up the politics to make it so. And it's the same situation here. Integrated over our use, we produce more BTUs than we consume, would be my guess. Not having had to look at the numbers too closely, because it's not a situation that really matters. We have 60 nuclear reactors. We are exporting LNG hand over fist. We export a lot of coal, and we produce an enormous amount of oil and liquids. And we could produce a lot more, by the way, if we just got out of the way of the chemical sector, the commodity sector that is always more than willing to put itself out of business by drilling too much in the name of growth. And so this is, of the things that concern me, the molecular fate of NAFTA, because again, we have Canada, Mexico, and the US strongly allied, sharing very long borders relatively peacefully, politics notwithstanding. the amount of heavy oil in Canada. We could have built Keystone Pipeline. You know, there's all manner of things that we could do if we ever had to get serious about such things. And if necessity is the mother of all invention, I do believe that we are, unlike, say, the UK or Japan, who are just not blessed with the resources and have no options but to print in the hopes of trying to debase their currency to get the energy they need. We, in fact, are blessed with all manner of commodities that the rest of the world needs, not the least of which is food and fertilizer and chemicals and so on. And we have not, thankfully, wasted that away, especially along the Gulf Coast.
That's great, and I had a intuition that was probably going to be your answer, so it's also good to hear as well, because I don't want obviously that would be catastrophic if we did enter into any of these worst case scenarios that we've discussed. I guess I would be curious about, do you think that China being the leader in nuclear and paving the way and doing the most effort to build as many of these nuclear power plants will give them a tactical advantage overall over us if we do not start doing so as well? Or
Of course, yeah.
And to further, I haven't refined this because I was just thinking about this as you guys were discussing. So this isn't a question I had prepped, but do you think that would be counterbalanced by the other issues that this country faces, though? Because I'm thinking more in the broad sense of the conversation of, will China overtake the US as the global economic leader? And energy is so essential, but at the same time, like, the reason I think that they haven't overtaken us as a currency is, who wants to be dependent on China over the US? Sure, we have tons of issues, but like, you can't ever predict what they're going to do, or what they're going to always be looking out for themselves. I mean, we are as well, but they could just straight up lie to you. There's no,
Sure.
It's just so unstable compared to us, and I think that leads us to be the dominant currency. And until that isn't the case, I've remained highly skeptical of any a loss of the dollar being the global currency. And so, and with that power, I think, I guess the question would be, do you think them making a lot of progression in this energy and these areas is enough to overcome that?
So I would begin by separating the people of China and the Chinese Communist Party.
Absolutely.
And the resources and the resourcefulness of the country and its people. But I would say you cannot analyze China without considering the Chinese Communist Party as it exists today. And I would be firmly in the camp that the countries that are opposed to China, that are more capitalistic and have a liberty mindset, are in a far better position to outcompete the Chinese. And I would hold that position regardless of what we think our direction is internally, vis-a-vis such freedoms and capitalism and slipping towards socialism and the welfare state and all of those things. There's just no comparison between the rule of law here versus there. Now, look, with all the politics and Hunter Biden and Donald Trump, and of course Fox News and MSNBC would like to distract you into thinking that everything is a crisis, because crisis is clicks and clicks is money. Having competed against the Chinese Communist Party effectively vis-a-vis state-owned enterprises, they are decapitalizing their environment at a massive rate. They are able to get things done quicker than we are, but that comes at a cost. And I do think that we still have enormous inherent advantages that no other country in the world has. And we've tried our best to squander as much of them as possible. To my answer earlier about, if King Doomberg reigned for a decade, what would happen in the decade that followed? But we still have the most dynamic, we have Silicon Valley, we have amazing universities. When I got my PhD, half of my class was from overseas, including me. And so, like, everybody wants to come here still. There's a reason why we have to debate border control. It's not flow out, right? It's flow in. And people want to come here for a reason. It is still the most dynamic, largest, capitalistic, you can come to this country with $20 in a suitcase and make something out of yourself, and nobody is going to get in your way if you try hard enough. I still believe that to be true. And as long as we still have that, sure, at the edges, there's grift and there's politics and there's big company fascism basically interfacing with government to do the dirty work that government can't get past legislatively, what we see in the censoring and all the other stuff. That's all true. It's nowhere near what's going on in China today. And and by the way, I've made my bet. I mean, I have a house here, I have kids here. This is, this is where we're going to make a go of it. I've got multiple passports. I'm living here.
Yeah.
You played your stakes.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I'm going to put some faith in your decision too. And yeah, and I would say that also, at the idea of people being the source of everything, especially in the semiconductor industry, and China, I think, graduates as many engineers a year as we do have in the US, was a statistic that may not be true, but is probably, there's a hint of truth within it. I does make me think back to what you mentioned earlier, the demographic issues that China have, and if we look at those over a historical sense, I mean, those tend to accelerate. Once you start turning over, that turnover can be quite rapid.
So I listened to Peter Zeihan, and I find him to be informative and entertaining, and he does a good job. I have a slightly different view.
Okay.
And my view of the demographics that matter for China would be to measure the size of the middle class of China and whether that's growing or not. Because unfortunately and callously, not all people are created equal. And so the growing middle class in China and India, and the inflection point of the energy needs of such people, for example, as they climb up the economic ladder and have more disposable income, is far more important to me than the integral of the total number of people, whether it's growing or shrinking. Because I do believe that the size of the middle class in a country has a far more important impact on. Now, Peter Zeihan will say things like, and he's right. I mean, who am I? He's done this for a living. I'm just giving you my view, having worked in and around China and lectured at major universities and so on in my career. That the growth from China has not been population driven. It has been the dynamic nature of that population vis-a-vis the GDP per capita, the growing size of the middle class, the consumer culture in China, and same thing in India and Indonesia and Pakistan and the vast majority of the 5 billion people in the global South. We wrote a piece called "Got Milk," where we made fun of this silliness in Ireland about culling their cattle in the name of climate change. I mean, you couldn't think of anything more stupid to do, especially when you consider there's only 5 million people in Ireland, and China can't count the number of its people to plus or minus 5 million. And the energy use per capita of Ireland, I'm just pulling up the data as I'm talking to you. The energy use per capita in the US is something like 70,000 kilowatt hours per person. And our GDP per capita is around $70,000 per person. The Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria, which is sort of the bottom 5 in that pyramid, that the 5 largest countries in the G7 outside of China that don't include the US. Those 3.9 billion people use less than a quarter of the amount of energy that we do today. So you take 4 billion people, which is more than 10 times the amount of people in the US, and you double their energy. You're talking, and by the way, that's modest. Like, that would be a lifestyle that you and I and Monty would reject, that we would revolt over. The prospects of the growth, the demographic, the total number of people in those countries don't matter as much to us as the number of people entering the middle class and the energy inflection and the economic activity that such people bring. That's our view.
The irony with euthanizing your cattle is that they're an energy source now with I can't remember the technology. There was a company
renewable methane. Yeah.
It's a big thing now.
Yeah. Love it. We've come full circle.
A long way.
Well, I saw something today, and maybe just a little bit of humor here as we approach the end. Cargill, which is one of the largest shippers of agriculture commodities in the world, and is looking to decarbonize shipping over the water, have invented ships that have large sails on them. So we're going we're going back to basics, boys.
Yeah.
Let's go get a pirate sail and sail the oceans, guys. Let's do it.
Sounds like a ton of fun. All right. Well, I really appreciate your time, Doomberg. I think this was a great conversation. Hopefully, in the future we can have you back on. And is there anything that everyone definitely go check out Doomberg Substack? If you're watching this on YouTube, we'll have links down below, of course, to that as well. And
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah.
Only thing I would say, two points. One, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. The time flew by, and a really robust discussion as anticipated. And second, yes, Doomberg.substack.com. We are 100% subscriber supported. So if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to check us out, you can sign up for free, and that will entitle you to a pretty thick preview of all of our pieces. And then hopefully one of those might entice you over the line and to become a paying supporter of Doomberg, which would be greatly appreciated. So thanks, Josh and Monty. It was great, and looking forward to coming back anytime you'll have me.
We appreciate
Thank you so much.
that. Thanks, Doomberg. And I'll go ahead and end the recording. Before I end the call, though,